The last time I trusted someone without question, it cost me nearly everything I had built in my life. I'm 91 years old now. My hands shake when I hold a cup of tea, and most of my days pass quietly in a small room inside a retirement home outside Pittsburgh. But there's one afternoon from 30 years ago that still plays in my mind as clearly as if it happened yesterday. It began with a knock on my door, a simple knock. And by the time that conversation ended, the life I believed I had lived for 40 years was gone. Tell me honestly, if someone you trusted like family sat across from you and revealed that the two people closest to you had been deceiving you for decades, how would you react? Would you scream? Would you walk away? Or would you sit there the way I did, completely frozen? My name is Harold Bennett. I was born in 1934. For most of my life, I believed I had been one of the lucky ones, a steady job, a loving wife, 2 children, a modest house, and a quiet neighborhood. Nothing glamorous, but it was enough. More than enough. I met my wife, Margaret, in the spring of 1958. It was at a small community picnic organized by the church in our town in Pennsylvania. I remember the exact moment I first noticed her. She was standing near a table pouring lemonade into paper cups, laughing at something someone said, the kind of laugh that makes other people smile without knowing why. I walked over and asked if I could have a cup. She handed it to me and said, "Only if you promise not to spill it." That was the first thing she ever said to me. Simple, but for some reason it stayed with me. We started talking that afternoon, and somehow the conversation stretched until the sun began to set, and everyone else had already started packing up chairs. A year later, we were married. We didn't have much money in those days. I worked at a steel manufacturing plant just outside town. Long hours, noisy machines, the smell of metal and oil in the air, but it was honest work. Margaret worked part-time at a local library until our first child was born. Our son, Michael, arrived in 1961. 3 years later, our daughter, Emily, came along. Life wasn't perfect, but it was steady, and sometimes steady is the greatest blessing there is. In 1965, after years of saving every spare dollar, we bought a small brick house on Willow Lane. 3 bedrooms, a creaky staircase, a backyard just big enough for a garden, and a swing set. I remember standing in the empty living room the first day we got the keys. Sunlight was coming through the windows and hitting the hardwood floor. And I thought to myself, this is where our whole life is going to happen. Have you ever had that feeling, that quiet certainty that you've finally reached the place you're meant to be? For a long time, I believed that house on Willow Lane was exactly that place. A few years after we moved in, new neighbors arrived next door. Thomas and Linda Walker. Tom worked in sales for a construction company. Linda was a nurse at the county hospital. They were friendly, easy to talk to, about our age. Tom and I started chatting over the fence while mowing our lawns. Before long, we were sharing beers on the porch during summer evenings, talking about sports, work, politics, the usual things men talk about. Linda and Margaret became close as well. Soon the 4 of us were spending holidays together, barbecues in the backyard, game nights, 4th of July, fireworks. If someone had asked me back then who my closest friend was, I would have answered without hesitation, Tom Walker. And if someone had asked me who I trusted more than anyone in the world, I would have said my wife. Funny how life works sometimes, because the two people you trust most can turn out to be the two people you should have been watching. But that realization didn't come until much later. Back then, everything seemed normal, or at least it seemed normal to me. Looking back now, there were signs, little things, strange things, things that didn't quite add up. But tell me something. When you love someone deeply, do you look for reasons to doubt them, or do you explain away the strange things because it's easier to believe everything is fine? Think about it for a moment. In 1976, Margaret began attending a weekly evening class at the community center. She said it was a literature group, people gathering to discuss novels and poetry. Every Thursday night she would leave around 7 and return close to 10. She always came home in a cheerful mood after those meetings. I remember thinking it was good for her. Everyone deserves something that belongs just to them. A few years later, she started wearing a different perfume. When I noticed it, she laughed and told me Linda had recommended it. I told her it smelled nice, and that was the end of that conversation. In 1982, Tom suddenly decided to build a tall wooden fence between our properties. Before that, we had shared an open yard for years, kids running back and forth between houses, neighbors stopping by to talk. I asked him why he wanted the fence. He shrugged and said he thought it would give the yards a little more privacy. I even helped him put up some of the panels one Saturday afternoon. Funny, isn't it? Helping build the wall that hides the truth from you. In 1987, Margaret moved into the guest bedroom. She said my snoring kept her awake. I didn't argue. After nearly 30 years of marriage, little things like that didn't seem unusual, at least not to me. Years passed, children grew up, Michael moved to Chicago for work, Emily became a school counselor and settled in Ohio. Margaret and I remained in the house on Willow Lane, two older people living quietly in a place full of memories. I retired in 1996 after 41 years at the steel plant. They gave me a plaque and a handshake. I remember driving home that day thinking life was finally slowing down. More time with Margaret, more peaceful evenings, but life had something else waiting for me. A month after my retirement, Linda Walker knocked on my door one afternoon. Tom was at work. Margaret had gone shopping. Linda looked exhausted, pale, like someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. She asked if she could come in and talk. We sat at the kitchen table, and after a long silence, she said something that completely stopped my world. She said, "Harold, I think you deserve to know the truth." Have you ever heard a sentence that made your stomach drop before the person even finished speaking? That was one of those moments. And then she told me, Margaret and Tom had been having an affair, not for a few months, not for a year, for nearly 2 decades, 20 years. the Thursday night literature class. That wasn't a class. It was time spent with Tom. The perfume, the separate bedrooms, the fence, all of it suddenly made sense. And I just sat there staring at the kitchen table. I remember noticing the pattern in the wood grain like I had never seen it before. It's strange the details your brain focuses on when something shatters your life. Linda had discovered old letters and hidden bank statements she had suspected for years, but only recently had she found proof. Proof that the two people we trusted most had been quietly building another life behind our backs. When Margaret came home that evening, I asked her about it. I expected denial, anger, excuses, but she didn't argue. She simply sat down and admitted everything. That moment hurt more than anything else. Not the betrayal, the calmness. Like it was just a fact of life. She said she still cared about me, but had never stopped loving Tom. Imagine hearing that from the person you built your life around. Tell me, what would you do? I wish I could say I handled it with strength, but the truth is I felt empty, just empty. Divorce followed the next year, and during that process I learned something even more painful. Money had been quietly moved from our accounts over many years. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. Plans had been made long before the truth ever reached me. By the time everything was finished, the house, the savings, most of what I had worked for was gone. At 66 years old, I started over, not by choice, by necessity. My health began failing not long after that. Arthritis, heart problems, eventually a stroke that made living alone impossible. That's how I ended up here in this nursing home. A small room, a bed near the window, 3 drawers holding everything I own. Margaret passed away years ago. Tom, too. Most of the people from that chapter of my life are gone now. And sometimes people ask me if I'm bitter, if I still feel angry. But age has a strange way of changing how you see things. Betrayal hurts. There's no pretending it doesn't. But holding on to anger for decades is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to suffer. So here is the lesson I want to leave you with. Trust is one of the most valuable things we give another human being. Guard it wisely, but don't let fear turn your heart cold either. Because despite everything that happened to me, I would still choose a life where I trusted people. Why? Because a life without trust is even lonelier than betrayal. And at the end of your days, when you're sitting quietly remembering your life, you'll realize something. The moments of love were still real, even if some of the people weren't.